Hi, how are you? I'm your host, Grim, or Jay, whichever one works for you. Um, Before we get into our story, let me just swap over the background to something more bloody. Well, without further ado, let's get started. Our first story is I delivered pizzas to an address I'd never heard of before. I almost didn't escape alive. When you're at the end of your shift as a delivery driver, there is one sentence that is worse than any other to hear. Hey Hal, hold up a minute. I've got a customer on the line. My shoulders slumped, and I felt a mix of exasperation and annoyance as I turned back towards the counter. Please tell me you're joking. I just finished hope I just finished helping clean the pizza parlor after an 8-hour shift of manning the phones in the register and running over what must have been the damn county, or at least half of it, delivering orders. I locked the front door and been in the middle of heading into the back room to clock out. I'm already mind already at home. Dinner waited for me, and my fiance laid in bed, ready to roll over and wrap her arms around me once I climbed in bed beside her. But my boss's call decided to put the delay to that. I stood there for a few minutes staring at his hulking figure as he leaned against the imitation brick, listening intently to whoever was on the other end of the line. Aside from his quiet replies and scribbling of a pencil in his notepad, the only sounds that could be heard were the hum of the building's ventilation system, which sounded like blues or swing music crackling out of the ancient radio in the back, and the constant smack of the rain against the glass in the front windows. I waited, shifting around impatiently on the balls of my feet, but finally he hung up and turned towards me. But I spoke before he even had a chance to open his mouth. You cannot be freaking serious, Tony. I've already locked up for the night and finished cleaning. Everything's powered down, and more to the point, we're closed. I pointed behind me to the clock ticking on the wall, which showed the time to almost be 10 at night. In response, Tony's face darkened, and he also pointed the meaty finger at the clock. Actually, Hal, if you take another look, we're not officially closed for another 5 minutes. And you remember our motto. He pointed to the large sign over the front counter. Whether an hour to close or a minute, if you order, we make it happen. His scowl intensified. That's been our creed since my father opened this joint 70 years ago. And it's not about to change now. I let out a groan. Dude, you take tradition a little too far, you know? You know that? He didn't respond, instead turning back and picking up the order he scribbled out before continuing. Anyways, the gentleman ordered 3 pepperonis and said he'd give the delivery driver a nice tip to compensate for ordering so late. Now he did turn back, giving me a sly look. And I thought, where you could always use the extra dough, that getting a few extra bucks would be something you'd jump at. I felt a sudden intense heat and forced myself to not begin the hurling string of insults at his smug face that I so badly wanted to. It's not all about the money. When I moved back to my hometown with my fiance to help take care of my sick mother 3 years ago, trying to find a job that I could use to pay the bills had been like trying to find a needle, not just in a haystack, but a damn grain silo. The place had already gone to hell since I'd left in the late 2000s, in large part due to the fact that many people my age weren't sticking around to help tend to the farms or stores like that for generations. With the shift of the last 2 decades, they had instead left for the cities, leading to many farms to fall into foreclosure and businesses in town to either economize or flat out close. And with our savings rapidly dwindling and Rita's remote job not set up yet, I've had no choice but to snatch up the first opening I could. As the cashier and sole delivery driver for the only pizza place still open around here. You know the old phrase, damned if you do and damned if you don't? That's exactly how I describe this job. It paid the rent on a small apartment we grabbed above the old hardware store, but only just. Every extra dollar I could make was vital to keeping our heads above water, and Tony knew that. And he delighted in running me ragged every chance he could for what amounted to scraps on the stray dog's plate. And I seriously hate the son of a bitch for it. I glared at the man for another moment, then let out a resigned sigh. He had me by the short hairs and knew it. Fine, I grumbled, holding my hands up and walking back across the room to stand next to him. A smirk crossed his face. I felt like punching the shit out of him, and he patted me on the shoulder, handing me the notepad as he walked past me. Just deliver these and you can head straight home afterwards. You can bring the money in with you in the morning. And hey, I'll even be a nice guy and make these two myself. Real kind of you, I thought, bitterly, but I held my tongue. Instead, I looked down at the paper, silently reading out the order before lowering my eyes to the address given, and I felt a slight pang of surprise about me. This address I'd never ever heard of, which to someone born and raised in the area was not something I was used to. Where in the hell is this address, Tony? I called out, turning and watching as he fired up the wood oven, dough and ingredients already laid out on the metal counter. He shrugged. I honestly don't know how. I've never heard of it before either, but it's not the first time. Don't forget, those big shot developers who bought up a lot of the farmland have been building into those subdivisions out here for the last 5 to 10 years, trying to get people out of here. Chances are someone actually was dumb enough to buy one, you know? And that's where it is. He turned back to making more pizza before calling over his shoulder. Anyways, he gave directions to get there and they're written on the back. I stared at his back for another few moments, then shrugged as well. It makes sense, I guess. I let out a very groaning sigh. 30 minutes, I stepped out the back door into the pouring rain, bending over to protect the boxes, and I made a mad dash for the car, which sat almost at the other end of the parking lot. By the time I reached it, jamming the key into the lock, my coat was soaked, and my hair was matted into my forehead. Dropping the pizzas into the passenger seat, I dropped it into the driver's seat and yanked the door shut. I threw off my jacket into the back seat and smoothed my hair back, rubbing my arms and shivering slightly as a loud rumble of thunder came from outside. February weather, I muttered, leaning over to open my glove box as I slid the key into the ignition in the center console. After fumbling for a bit, I pulled out a battered map, flicking on the dome light as I unfolded it. Shifting my gaze between it and the directions, I traced my finger over it as I read the first few lines, which led me out of town onto the back roads. Well, ain't that pretty weird? But it wasn't long before it became useless, and the thing was about 30 years out of date, showing nothing besides a dead end where the directions told me to turn. Great, I muttered, dropping it onto the top of the pizza boxes. No GPS to help out either, and starting the car. This is what you get for driving a Saab 900 from the late 80s. You should have taken Rita's suggestion and bought a TomTom or something. And I let out another sigh. No point in crying over spoiled milk now. As I flicked on the headlights and wipers, the warmth from the heater began blasting to my face. I saw Tony lock in the back door and he gave me a curt nod before running to his truck. The bitterness reared its ugly head as I watched him drive away, knowing he was going home to his own soft and warm bed, but I shook my head to cast it away. Releasing the parking brake and shifting it into first gear, the car rolled forward, and I cast a last look at the darkened shape of the pizza joint, flanked on either side by a video rental store and shops which had been boarded up years ago. Well, that and the laundromat are the only things keeping the strip mall from going the way of the dodo, I said to myself. Turning left, I headed down the main drag, the last of the dark buildings sliding past as I headed out of town, wanting to break away the silence filling the car. I messed around with my iPod a bit. It was connected to a cassette adapter in the car's stereo, and a moment later, the lips of Jane Mansfield spilled from the speakers. Tapping my fingers to the steering wheel, on beat, I glanced at the directions again. They said to take a couple of turns once I left town. And after making sure I had enough gas to make it there and back, I began what I would hope to be a relatively short journey. But probably due to my bad mood and crappy weather, it seemed like an eternity. I kept glancing around as I made turn after turn, seeing only farmland and forests. As the minutes ticked by, my irritation grew, especially as a new thought entered my mind. I hope to God some dumbass teenagers didn't decide to prank the place by ordering pizzas out in the middle of fucking nowhere. It wouldn't be the first time due to the lack of things to do. It became a favorite pastime of theirs, and more than once I'd find myself at an empty house with an order in my hands. Even though he'd been the one to fall for it, Tony always directed his anger at me, occasionally even docking my pay for something that was just out of my control. And I really don't need that again, man. Reaching out and cranking the radio as Depeche Mode began to play, trying to drown out the thoughts. The darkened shape of a farm flew by on my left, and I allowed my foot to ride a little heavier on the gas, and the speedometer climbing to 40 as I rounded the bend. According to the directions, the turnoff should be just ahead. I braced myself to see nothing more than a yellow dead end sign proclaiming my venture out in the boonies to be for nothing. Instead, really to my surprise, and admittedly relief, I came to a three-way section, one which had a street sign at the corner, and I flicked on the turn signal and slowed down, squinting to see the words displayed on it. Sycamore Street. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding in, and I turned right and headed down it. My optimism rising as streetlights began to appear frequently, lining the side of the road like sentries. And a few moments later, as the road dipped into the valley, I finally saw it. Whoa. Tony was right about the subdivisions being built out here, and I stared down at each row upon row of houses, which in the dark seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. I could only see large buildings, ones that had ones that had to be stores of some kind dotted around. No wonder I never heard about this place. It's an entirely self-sufficient community. I whispered, and I felt a sharp pang of bitterness, this time not directed at my boss, but surprisingly towards the community before me. I knew with the inevitable march of time that nothing could ever stay the same forever. But the idea that as my hometown slowly dried up and died, another one was rising so close, replacing the farms I'd known all my life and more or less wiping out what came before, stung more than I cared to admit. I just shook my head slightly as the car headed down the hill. Just focus on this for now, Hal, and you can go home. But as the community rose upon me, another thought suddenly dawned on me. The directions the caller had given Tony were so detailed how to get up here at this point, along with the street and house number, but they hadn't said where to go once I got here. and I let out an exasperated groan. The way this place looked like a damn maze from the top of the hill, it'll take half the night to find the house. But the feeling of defeat began to creep back up on me until my eyes spotted the first building I was approaching. It seemed to be a gas station. No, it was a gas station. One that had been decorated to resemble those of the mid 20th century. I could see a display of oil sitting in front of the first set of pumps. The bottles and cans glinting in the overhead lights. Breathing a sigh of relief, I turned into it, parking under the awning and shutting the car off. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, closing my eyes and listening to the rain pelting the metal awning as another rumble of thunder rever- eh, my bad, reverberated through the valley. And then I pushed the door open and stepped onto the concrete. Instantly, rain and gasoline invaded my nostrils, causing them to burn slightly and slamming the door shut. I jogged across the door of the accompanied convenience store. Reaching out, I pulled it open, stepping inside as I heard the entrance of a bell chime somewhere out of sight, and a sight of the rain dulled as I stepped inside. But it was replaced by the buzzing and ticking of a clock, and lights as well, somewhere as I looked around. The counter of my right was empty, the register left unattended. Bags of snacks and rows of refrigerators fought for space with rows of auto parts and fluids. I couldn't help but let out a small snort as my eye spied a row of Boone's Farm bottles set next to the windshield wiper fluid. A somewhat messed up thought, just gliding and sliding into my mind. Hope nobody grabs the wrong bottle by mistake. Turning and walking to the counter, I spied a bell. Reaching out, I gave it a small tap and a shrill, metallic sound echoed throughout the store. I waited for a few seconds as the echo died away, replaced once again by buzzing lights, hum of the refrigerators, and ticking clock. I let out a nice yawn, but nobody opened the door to the garage or came out from the restroom in the back corner. And I drummed my fingers on the counter, then spared a look at the watch on my wrist. It's 11:15. Come on, man. Somebody, I hissed, reaching out and smacking the bell again, this time a bit harder. The sound reverberated all throughout my ears, and as it died away, I felt my exasperation bloom into annoyance. Finally, after my watch told me it had been 5 minutes, I turned around, heading for the entrance and resigning myself to the search of the address. Excuse me, can I help you? The voice which came from behind me almost caused me to jump a foot in the air as I whirled around, unable to keep a surprised grunt from escaping my lips. A man now stood at the counter, smiling at me. I let out a deep sigh, but after a moment, trying to get my heart under control, he spoke again. I'm very sorry I didn't come right away. I was in the restroom when you hit the bell. And well, call of nature can't be stopped once it's been heated. He let out a chuckle at his own quip, which annoyed me furthermore, then repeated his question. Is there anything I can help you out with? For a moment I couldn't find my voice, and the fact that this guy had somehow left the bathroom without me hearing the door open, or the sound of his feet on the tiled floor, almost gave me a heart attack. Dude must walk like a spec op soldier to pull that off. Finally regaining my composure, I stepped back towards the counter and pulling the directions from my pocket of my jeans, clearing my throat, I then said, yeah, if you could please. See, the pizza place I work at the next town over got an order from here, and the directions I was given only get me as far as here. They gave me the street name and the house number, but with how many roads I saw from the top of the hill, that's about as useful as a friggin' screen door on a submarine. Before I could continue, the man let out a loud bark of laughter, shaking his head as he slapped the counter. That's a good one, Sonny, he said. I raised an eyebrow, confused. It honestly hadn't been that funny, but he continued, hopefully. Yeah, so I was kind of hoping that you might be able to just point me in the right direction so I could deliver it and be on my way. It's the last delivery of the night, and I'd love to be home. The man seemed to soak up my request and nodded, holding out a hand for the directions, and I handed them to him. Glancing out the window as he read, the rain seemed to be letting up. Thank goodness for that. And I turned back as he snapped his fingers. Ah, yes, I know the address. It belongs to a wonderful family that just moved in recently. The Corrigans. He pulled a pen from his pocket and began to write on the paper. Let me just write you the directions. I'm sure they're beyond starving and looking forward to eat. I nodded absent-mindedly, already planning in my head how to explain my delay to Rita if she woke up when I got home. Glancing out at the lights of the first house as a question popped in my head. Hey, by the way, when did this place get put up? I didn't hear anything about it on my way back. Or nothing, really. The man answered, still bent over. Oh, not too long ago, really. The developers who set it up already did so with many rural areas across the country. They're expanding now, and the residents which are moving in, myself included, love these kinds of areas. Plenty of beautiful views, fresh air for the children to play in. He paused for a moment before finishing. Well, to be quite honest, and this is just my opinion, but the local food around here is to die for. For a second, I simply nodded absent-mindedly again. I did not give a shit. Then, as if on a delayed reaction, the man's words suddenly clicked in my head. With them came a small wave of confusion, and I turned back to him to stare at the top of his head. Oh, what? Aside from the pizza place, a Sizzler, and a subpar Italian restaurant which had somehow remained open despite everything, the nearest restaurant was at least 50 miles away. And there was no way anyone would describe any of these three places to die for. I don't know, maybe he's trying to be nice. I pushed it away as he stood up, holding the paper for me to take back. Here you go. Hopefully it'll be easier for you to follow. Feeling relieved, I reached out and took the directions from him, glancing at them for a moment before sliding them back in my pocket and raising my eyes to him, my mouth opening to thank him. That's when I noticed something, which unsettled me somewhat. The man was still smiling at me. I hadn't really noticed it at first, but during our entire back and forth, it hadn't faltered for a second. Even now, the same exact expression adorned his face, and those pearly white teeth were reflecting the overhead lights. Not only that, but his eyes seemed to almost contain the same twinkle they had which when he first saw me. As if privy to some sort of hilarious joke he chose to keep to himself. A small shiver raced up my spine, and feeling more than a bit creeped out, I moved towards the door, forcing my voice out, calmer than I felt. Thanks a lot, man. This helps. Have a great night, I said to him. I turned and strode quickly for the exit. Behind me, I heard the man's cheerful voice ring out for a final time. You as well! Then I raised the door, jogging back through the rain towards my sab, opening the doors and climbing inside. I quickly shut it behind me and impulsively locked it. For a few moments, I just sat there, trying to make sense of the interaction. Nothing about it just seemed normal or even remotely normal. I shivered slightly as I started the car, but I glanced back at the window, just feeling something from the awning. I instantly regretted my decision. The man was staring out the window at me. His face was blurred from the window. From the rain, really, but I bet my bottom dollar he was still smiling. What the hell? I know not everyone here will be like him, but if we get any more deliveries out here, I'm avoiding this place like the plague. The one good thing that came out of the encounter was the directions. As creepy as that was, he'd been accurate at least. Less than 10 minutes later, I was pulling up in front of the house and the rain thankfully stopped. As I stepped out the car, pizzas in one hand, I inhaled the smell of the wet grass from the lawns, and in the distance I could see the thunder rumbling as the storm moved away from here. For the first time since Tony had called to me, I felt relief, and allowed a small smile on my face to just form. After all the crap that's happened tonight, all I gotta do is deliver, and I'm home free. Crossing up the path which led to the house, I allowed myself to glance around, and I paused for a second. In the driveway of the house sat about the last car I ever expected to see in a place like this. It was a green Dodge Coronet from the early 70s, and the sedan's paint and bodywork looked pristine. Huh, I said, then looking to the other side, expecting to see a Mercedes or a Lexus in the driveway next door. To my other surprise, I saw what happened to be an early 80s Land Cruiser. Like the Dodge, this too appeared to be in showroom condition. This is something I didn't expect. I would have thought folks in a place like this would own brand new luxury cars or SUVs, not stuff from 40 to 50 years ago. Go figure. Shaking my head for what felt like the millionth time tonight, I resumed my walk to the front door, climbing the porch steps and reaching out with my free hand for the doorbell. I gave it a press, hearing the chime ring out inside. For what seemed to be a moment, I could hear the distant rumble of thunder and the whipping wind before reaching out and hitting the doorbell again. From somewhere within the house came a woman's voice. "Just a minute!" Satisfied I got no reply, I stepped away from the front door and waited. A moment later, I saw movement behind the frosted glass to the sides, and the same voice said, "Who is it?" I said, "Pizza delivery, ma'am. I have your order." In response, I heard the sound of the door being unlocked, and after another moment, it swung open. There was a woman only a few years older than me, I could tell. Her mousy brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a pair of slacks and a button-up shirt. She smiled warmly at me as she spied the pizza in my hands. "Of course!" She noticed my lack of a coat and beckoned to me. "Please come inside out of this horrible weather. You don't need to be getting sick." Smiling gratefully, I nodded then, wiping my feet on the mat, and I stepped inside as she closed the door behind me. The interior hall was warm and inviting, and I felt myself relax a bit as the woman stepped back in front of me. She began to open her mouth to speak, but was interrupted as a man called from somewhere in the back of the house. "Honey, is that the delivery boy?" And the woman turned away from me. "Yes, it is, darling." She turned back to me, gesturing to the pizzas in my hand. "My husband will be right out to pay you. Can I take these? Our boys are starving, and I promised them something to eat before they went to bed." According to Tony, I wasn't to let go of the deliveries until I'd been handed the money, but since I was already here, I didn't see the harm. I handed them to her, and she gave me another smile before turning and heading down the hall. Left alone, I rubbed my still chilly arms and glanced around. The hallway was done in a very cozy retro style. Wood paneling covered the walls, and a patterned carpet lined the floor. Photos hung from the wall, and as I stepped slightly to examine the closest one, it showed the woman, beaming and standing next to her husband, a tall, muscular man in his early 40s who smiled as well, and two small, tow-headed boys stood in front of them, also smiling at the camera. The picture caused me to crack another smile, seeing the happy family and feeling a pang of nostalgia for the days that I posed like this with my parents. I looked at the next one, and the four were standing on what seemed to be a beach of some sorts, dressed in swim trunks. Turning my head slightly, I looked at the third photo. I had just begun to take it into the fact that they were standing in front of a house, when something clicked in my head and I leaned back. Looking at the first picture, then the second and the third, for a moment, what I was seeing didn't connect. I looked at the photos again, and there was a huge fucking chill passing through me. All four of them wore the exact same smile in each photo. I don't mean they were similar, they were the exact same ones. All identical, something that was impossible. No person can perfectly replicate the same smile or expression twice, whether it be due to face muscles or outside elements, let alone the four. What the fuck? I whispered, taking a step back and feeling as though I'd been drenched with ice water. My mind whirred, and I felt my heart began to thump in my chest. Okay, calm down, Hal, I thought. Get a hold of yourself, you're just really overthinking. They don't have the same smile in every picture, and you've had a long night. You're tired. Just get over this and go home. I almost began to believe it, feeling myself to relax until a sound came from behind me in the den. I hadn't glanced over when I entered, having been too focused on the woman at the time, but as I slowly turned towards the source of the noise, my eyes slid over something and my mind slowly followed behind. The wallpaper looking brand new but done in a pattern that looked out of fashion. I saw the circular couch and chairs, all done in muted reds and greens, or in the case of one chair, plaid. I saw the green carpet, which I numbly realized was a shag style I hadn't seen since my uncle ripped up his in the early 2000s. I saw the weirdly shaped lamps and tables. Then my eyes landed on the far side of the room. The two boys I seen in the pictures, they sat on the floor in front of a TV, faced away from me, and I could only see the back of their heads as they played video games. And since every small kid, including my own cousins, play games nowadays, it wouldn't have been what fixed my attention had it not been for two details. The first was that they weren't sitting in front of a flat screen TV. They sat in front of a huge CRT set, one which was clad in wood paneling, looking like something out of an old Montgomery Ward catalog. In a second, they weren't playing PlayStation, Nintendo, or Xbox. I couldn't see the console from where I stood, but I didn't need to. I could see the screen, hear the sounds drifting out from the speakers. They were playing on an Atari. In any other situation, it would have been something I'd had just batted an eye at. In fact, I would have loved seeing kids play retro games, as I grew up with them. But between the identical smiles and the photographs, this was just really, really becoming weird to me. To rationalize the brand new 70s decor, and this, it felt like the cherry on top of the proverbial creepy sundae. Just like with the guy in the gas station, nothing about this place seemed right, and every alarm bell was ringing in my head. Thus, when the two boys looked at me, whether they sensed my gaze or not, I don't know. All I know is I had to force down a scream at their expressions because both of them stared at me with identical smiles. Both of them. Smiles which mirrored those then worn in the pictures I'd gazed at. Something clicked inside of me and I realized why the gas station attendant had creeped me out. It wasn't the fact he never stopped smiling. It was the smile that didn't seem genuine. Like they were painted on like a facade designed to lull someone into a false sense of serenity. All this flashed through my mind as they kept staring at me and I swallowed a bit. I feebly attempted to plaster a smile of my own on my face and gently raised a hand to wave at them. Neither one of them moved, only kept staring at me, and all the hair on my body was standing on end, and I took a step back. You know what? Screw this. I'll eat the cost of what Tony will saddle me with. It's time to get the hell out of here, and feeling vulnerable, taking my eyes off those two boys, I turned to head towards the front door, only to come face to face with two grinning visages. Just like with the gas station, I hadn't heard the woman come down the hall. She stood almost directly in front of me, and her husband by her side. I realized he was almost a half foot taller than me, something that, at 6'2", I wasn't used to.
something to eat. It's in there.
Okay.
Oh, they check the thing again to see if the cameras, they can't see them.
Yeah, I'll check the cameras. Huh, this thing is out of place. My bad for that slight delay. But let's get back into it. Sorry to take you out of the immersion, but this is whenever things become swiggity swoogity. And by that I mean creepy, eerie, and very out of place. Buckle up. For a moment there was silence, and the man spoke. You'll have to forgive me, young man. I was busy putting away the leftovers in the freezer, and my wife here always nags me about being rude. They both let out laughs like their smile were about as real as clowns' face paint, and for a moment I wasn't able to say anything until my mind began screaming at me. Play along! If they don't realize you're onto them, you might be able to leave. I took another almost um, imperceptible step back and forced myself to speak in a voice that was the antithesis of what I felt. It's quite all right, sir. Believe me, my fiance nags me about the same thing, and both of them chuckled again, and I felt a shiver at that sound. Well, I'm glad I'm not the only one with that issue. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his wallet. Now, how much do I owe you? He asked. 24.76, I managed out. This better have been some big ass pizzas. He pulled out the money, counting for a second before holding it to me. Here you are, son, plus a tip for the trouble of being so late. Feeling as though I were inches away from escape, I forced a smile on my lips and reached out, grasping the money he offered, risking a glance up at their faces as I did, and froze. I don't mean I froze in fear or indecision. As soon as my eyes met theirs, it felt much the same way someone who's been hypnotized must have felt. Everything drifted away, and I was vaguely aware of my arms lowering at my sides. Vision blurring, and the sounds began to feel as though I were hearing them from a long tunnel, and part of my mind attempted to scream at me, but I was unable to react to it. I just simply stood there, almost feeling as if I stepped out of space and time, and very faintly, I heard the sound of the boy's voice calling out. Mom, we're hungry. Is it time to eat yet? After a moment, a woman's voice answered, sounding just as distant as the boy's had. Yes, dear, it's time. For some reason, I'll never be able to understand why, that one sentence snapped me back to my senses. I came to flying forward from the dark tunnel I drifted to, back in the hallway. And as soon as I did, I had to clamp my jaw shut to keep my screaming, especially screaming from my lungs. All four of them stood in front of me, less than 2 feet away. All four of them still wore the exact same smiles, with one horrifying difference. One that I've never seen in my nightmares before. Their heads were tilted down slowly. Their smiles no longer seemed fake and inviting. They now looked absolutely genuine. And so very fucking hungry. As soon as the realization hit me, it was a blur of motion, twisting around and dashing for the front door. Behind me, I felt more than heard the family recoil in surprise. They didn't expect me to snap out of my trance. I knew that they would regain their composure in seconds, but I was already tearing open the front door, dashing outside and slamming it closed behind me. I took a huge, bounding step and launched myself off the porch, beginning to dash for my car, but I had taken less than 3 steps when I froze again. This time, I was no longer alone out on the street. Everyone was outside. Men, women, children, and teenagers. All of them stood in the yellow glow spilling out of their open hallways, doors, anything. But some were only a few steps outside, everything illuminated, where others were closer to the street, but they all wore the exact horrific expression on their faces. The same hunger, the same hungry smiles as that family inside. Finding my feet again, I raced for my sab. Behind me, I heard the sound of the front door opening. I didn't dare to glance back. I knew if I did, the exact same spell would happen before, and this time I wouldn't be able to come out of it. I didn't look at anyone, merely kept my gaze fixated on the car. Mercifully, I hadn't locked it, so thank fuck for that, and I yanked the driver's door open, launching myself into the seat and slamming it behind me. Fumbling with the keys, I jammed them into the ignition, and the engine roared to life as I spared a glance as I yanked the shifter into first gear. I caught a glimpse of everyone advancing on my car, those hungry smiles still fixated, but now their eyes held a mixture of anger and desperation, and I fucking floored it. The sound of the screeching tires filled my ears as I shot forward, car launching down the street. I heard something slam into the back of my car and felt the rear end fishtail slightly. Fighting for control, I shifted into third gear and kept my foot hard down. The sap straightened out and I glanced down at the speedometer. Seeing as I was already doing 45, I took that first left, trying as hard as I could to recall the layout, to just navigate to reach my destination. I'm not getting lost in suburbia, hell. As I took another left, I chanced a look in the rearview mirror, and this time, I screamed. More and more people were emptying out of their houses, the entire subdivision. By the time I looked at those things, that wasn't what had caused me to scream. It was the face. They were running after me, and they were keeping up. I shot another look at my speedometer. I was doing 50 miles per hour. How is this fucking possible? I screamed. But as I took another left, finally seeing the main road, there was an 8-year-old girl, hair done up in pigtails in her face, hungry like the others. In an animalistic grin, running after my car and keeping pace. She was on all fours, and I slammed the car into fourth gear as the speedometer climbed towards 70, and finally the people began to fall away behind me. I never relented, and I kept my foot hard down as the car's engine screaming in the cabin as the gas station approached on my right. I cast a look over it as I flew past. The gas station attendant stood at the side of the road. He didn't dare to block my path. Instead, simply watched me fly past him. I only had a moment to notice one detail. Unlike the others, he didn't have a grin. Instead, like a child's Halloween mask, it was expressionless. And that was one final detail I overlooked the entire time. While slammed into it just slammed into me like a train. None of them blinked. And that horrific night was almost 2 weeks ago now. I never let up onto the gas until I made it back into town. I kept glancing every 2 seconds to make sure I wasn't being followed, and I raced towards the sheriff's department, almost taking out a row of parking meters as I screeched to a halt in front of it. I must have looked like a lunatic with how I bursted in there, ranting and raving, and the sheriff and his deputies were understandably dubious as I recounted my experience, but once I managed to produce the directions I thankfully held on to, he sent a few of them in their cruisers to investigate it. They came back about an hour later with confused expressions. The words one of them said made my mouth drop open. "Sheriff, all we found is a dead-end road. There's nothing out there." The worst part isn't nobody believed me, as much as they tried to pretend otherwise. I knew they do to a certain degree for two reasons. Both evidence of what I said, and the first was the money. I'd never let go of it after I grabbed it, keeping it balled in my fists until I gotten into the car and snatched for the keys. All of it looked brand new, with one exception. The newest date on any of the bills was 1984, and the second was the scratches on the back quarter panel of my Saab, scratches that more resembled claw marks than humans. And the worst part is, they knew no one else would believe it. I guess that's why they quietly put up cement barriers on that stretch of a road a week and a half later, to keep anyone else from driving there, to keep anyone else from falling prey to whoever or whatever those things are. I know they're still there because a day before the barricades went up, I ventured out into that road again, and don't ask me why. Not even I fully understand. I prayed I'd seen what the deputies had seen, simply a dead-end road. Instead, for me and me alone, it was the same three-way intersection. The same sign. Sycamore Street. I quit my job working at the pizza place the very next day, and Tony gave me hell for it, for not bringing the money in. I simply told him to call the sheriff. I'm trying to find some kind of remote job. And Rita, God bless her, she's been helping me. I should have an interview coming up in the next few days if it weren't for the fact that my mother lives here and refuses to leave the house my dad built for her. I would have packed my shit and left. But we don't seem to be in any danger here in the town, so we stayed for now at least. And that brings me to why I'm posting this here. The first is those horrible nightmares every night since. Nightmares about what would have happened if I didn't snap out of that trance, what they would have done to me. And I don't give a damn if you believe me or not, because this is just a form of catharsis for me, hoping something that may stop me from waking my fiance up with my screams. But I have another reason, and regardless if you believe me, I beg you, I absolutely beg you, because please, if nothing else, heed this warning. I can't stop thinking about that man in the gas station, or whatever he was. The developers who set it up already did so with many other rural areas across the country. They're expanding now. That's the one thing I keep remembering. Because if this is the same way, you might be next. That sentence of the developers who set it up already did so with many rural areas across the country, and they're expanding now. If you find yourself in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere, and you stumble across a seemingly secluded community or suburb, one you never heard about being built, filled with things that make it seem like a place out of time, do not investigate it. You just turn around and drive away as fast as you can from it, and don't look back, because things dwell in them, waiting for or sometimes luring people out there. Much the way an anglerfish uses the light on his head to lure prey closer enough to devour. And unlike me, you might not make it out. Well, that story took about a long bit. That was gripping, captivating. That was something absolutely you would need to look forward to in a horror tale like that. I think we can all agree, fuck Tony. Well, my name is Grim, or Jay, and thank you for sticking around for this horror tale. I'm sorry I haven't been keeping a consistent schedule and more with the horror tales, but thank you for being around. It really does matter. I know it's daytime, but I'm going to try to do these things whenever I can. Once again, thank you. Leave a like, comment, or subscribe if you really enjoy these. And if you have any suggestions or anything like that, let me know.